welcome builders. So today we're going to be talking about interfaces. And I kind of feel like interfaces are one of those things that even seasoned developers can kind of mess up. I know early on in my career, I had a few interviews which I bombed because they just flat out said, "What's an interface?" And while I had read the definition online, I still didn't have my head truly wrapped around what it is. And it's really not that complicated. So we're going to hop over to the board and illustrate what is an interface and then what is an implementation. And then we're going to hop into Visual Studio and look at a real example and run it and kind of see how things are built. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Okay, so we're on the board, and to get us started, let's create an interface. And essentially an interface is, think of it as like an outline for a service. So a service is going to be something that encapsulates some kind of functionality. So in this example, let's say we have like a messaging service. So we want to create a messaging service where we can pass it a message and it's going to deliver that message. Now, the details of the implementation, we don't have to worry about. I just know I'm going to send it a text or string for that message, and then this service is going to be responsible for sending it. Now, whether that's an email, a text message, insert into a database, that doesn't matter while we're writing our interface. And that's the difference. An interface is purely that outline. The implementation of that interface is how things will actually function. So let's get started with what we'll call our iMessage interface. Okay, so let's get a little box going here. And all interfaces in C# start with a capital I. So iMessage service is our interface. And since it's an interface or a abstract function, I'm going to use dots or dashes to outline it because it's not something we can call directly. It's purely an interface that we can interact with in our code without referencing a specific implementation. And we'll get into what that means here in just a minute. So for now, we have our iMessage service, and this will have basically 2 bits of functionality. It's going to have a name, so a string name, and that's going to be a get. So I can ask the service, "What's your name?" and it'll return a string. And then next, it's going to have the ability to send, and this will take in a string message. Okay? So I haven't defined the details of the implementation. So I don't know what the name's going to be for this service, and I don't know how it's going to send the message. I just know it's going to take in a string of that message and it's going to send it, whatever that means. The details of those methods are defined in the implementations of this interface. And we do that using inheritance. So let's say we have a new instance of this iMessage service. And let's say the first one's going to do like an email. So let's get a new box here, and this is going to be my email message service. And we'll use a solid line for this one because it's an actual service that I can reference. So I've got an email message service now, and it's going to inherit from iMessage service. Since I'm inheriting from this interface, I have to implement the same methods and properties that are defined in that interface. So my new email message service is going to have to define the name and allow its consumers to get the name, which will return a string. And then it's going to have that send method where it'll take in a string message and then deliver that message. In the case of an email message, that means I need to create an SMTP client and actually send out that email. So the cool thing about interfaces is now I can create more implementations of this service. For example, let's say I wanted to have like a database message service. So let's call this our DB message service. And just like we did with the email message service, DB message service is going to do the same thing. It has to implement the name property and the send method. So it's going to take in that string message, and the DB message service, instead of sending an email, is just going to do an insert into the database. Okay? Now, the cool thing is, from a consumer's perspective, meaning it's an application that is leveraging these message services, I don't have to know the implementation. It's no longer tightly coupled. It's loosely coupled in that the overarching application doesn't have to know the details of the implementation. It just says, I'm going to receive a message, whether it's from the user or some other source, and then I'm going to deliver it using a message service. So let's say to start, we knew this functionality was going to grow. But to start, maybe we just have messages drop to a text file. Or maybe we want to have it send text messages to our phone. And then as the application grows, maybe we want it to send emails. Or eventually we want it to go into a database, right? The cool thing about interfaces is our consuming application doesn't have to change, because all it's doing is calling iMessage service. It's calling the interface blindly, not having to worry about the implementation. And similarly, we can also create like a list of services. I could have a collection of iMessage services, and then I could iterate through that collection blindly and just say, for each service in my message services, send it. So here's the message that I have to send, and then I'm going to iterate through all of these services and just hit send. And then maybe it'll send an email, send a text message, drop it in the database, send an FTP. It can do all of these things without the overarching application having to know the details. Okay, so let's take a look at Visual Studio and look at actually how these are built. But first things first, we need to go get our repo. So go to github.com/buildsharper under repositories. We're going to clone Course 401. Download that, clone it on your local. And again, if you aren't familiar with how to do that, we have a course specifically dedicated to Git, or you can watch Course 0, which does kind of a brief overview of Git and how to download source tree and things like that. So once you've got Course 401 pulled down on your local, let's go ahead and open it up in Visual Studio. Okay, so here I am in Visual Studio. I've got my buildsharper.course401 solution popped up, and let's take a look. So in our program CS, we can see we're creating a collection of services. This list of iMessage service. If I look at the details on iMessage service, so we're going to go into services, interfaces, iMessage service. And as we said, this has a property name, which only has a getter. So from the consuming applications, they can't actually set the name. That's only going to happen within the actual implementation of that service. And then it's got a send method where it'll take in a string message. Okay? So back to Program CS. I've got this list of iMessage services, and then I'm loading in 3 different implementations of this interface. I have the DB message service, where it's going to take messages and store them in the database. I've got an email message service, which is going to send emails, and then an SMS message service, which will send text messages. And yes, if you happen to know how text messaging works, it technically is just an email, but I actually used a different library to send email versus SMS, just so we could kind of add some variety to this application. So, and we'll look at the details of that in just a minute. Okay, so we're asking the user enter a message to be delivered. And we're capturing that message into this variable called message. And now we're doing a for each on our services. So the cool thing is this is kind of where the magic of interfaces comes in, because I don't have to call each individual service. Since all of them implement the same interface, I can blindly call those services in my code. So you can see here we're doing a console.writeLine sending message via service.name. So whatever these services name themselves, it's going to print here. And then I'm doing a service.send where I'm sending that message which we captured from the user input. Okay, and then finally, after iterating through all those services, we're done. So before we dig into these services, let's actually run the application and take a look at what it does. All right, so we've got buildsharper.com interface demo. Enter a message to be delivered. This is my test message, exclamation point. Okay, sending message via database. There's via email, and then finally via SMS. And we're done. So let's take a look. So as we said, there's 3 different implementations of our message service. One's in the database, one's in email, and then one is SMS. So the first one we're going to take a look at is this DB message service. So let's take a look at our database and see if the message made it there. So I'm in SQL Server Management Studio. I have a buildsharper database, and I've created this message table. This is a table where we have just a message ID to be the row ID. We have the message text, and we have a date sent. And you see previously I had run this query and there was no results here. So now I'm going to execute this again. And there it is. This is my test message. It was just sent, and we can see it successfully got inserted into the database. Okay? Now, similarly, I'm going to hop over and take a look at our email. So for the email, we're using a fake SMTP service called ethereal.email. This is so we can simulate emails being sent without actually having to create fake accounts and things like that. So it's a quick and easy way to test email. So now that I've created my account, so I'm going to go over to messages, and I can see here's my buildsharper.com interfaces email service. If I look at this, this is my test message. So it worked. So what we just typed in got sent to the database, and then it got sent via email as well. Now I can't show you the SMS version because actually I'm using my phone to record this, but trust me when I say it got delivered. So now let's take a look at the code. So I'm going to go back into Visual Studio, and let's look at the details on this DB message service. So I can see this, this DB message service, public class, it's inheriting from the iMessage service. And that means that I have to implement those methods and properties that are defined in that interface. So the 2 that we had in message service was name and send. Okay, so now back in the DB message service, I have a name, which is going to return database. And then I have my send method, which takes in that message. And then within that method, I'm going to open up a DB connection. I'm going to add our new message where we're specifying the message text equals the message that was passed in, and just giving it a date sent of datetime.now. And then I save changes, which is going to commit that to the database. And by the way, if you aren't familiar with this database connectivity, this is using Entity Framework, and we have a course on that as well if you want to go hop over and check that out. So now let's take a look at the email service. Again, this is implementing our iMessage service, so we have to define name, which is going to return email, and then the send method. And for this, we're using a third-party library called MailKit, which is a NuGet package that we're pulling into the project, and then using it to actually send out the email itself. And then finally, in our SMS service, again, we're implementing our iMessage service, specifying the name as SMS. And this one's send method is, again, like we said, an SMS message is essentially an email. But to differentiate the two, I'm just using the standard SMTP client built into the .NET framework instead of using that MailKit. So it's a different implementation of email so that we could differentiate between the email service and the SMS service. Now, once you pull this down, to get it running on your local, you're going to have to do a few things to get set up. The first of which is to call the DB message service. You're going to need an instance of a database running on your local. You can do that by downloading SQL Express and installing it. Then you'll create a new database. In our case, we called it Build Sharper, and then you'll have your message table. If you look in this project, there's also this SQL script.txt. If you open this up, this is the script to go create that message table. Okay, so you'll create your database, this Build Sharper database, then execute this script to create your table. And then you can actually do your inserts and your select star from message to go ensure that that message was delivered successfully. Okay? And then for the email service, this is all defined in the app config. So you can see we have the email, from address, SMTP, username, and password. All of these are going to come from that ethereal.email website that we talked about. You can go on there, create a free account, and it will give you these details that you can copy and paste into your app config. And then finally, for the SMS, this would be your actual email and your cell phone provider. So in my case, I have Verizon, so I typed in my number at whatever it is, vtex.com, and then it sends that email directly to my phone as an SMS text message. And that's pretty much it. Hopefully you get the concept of an interface and an implementation. Interfaces are things we can call blindly without having to know those details of the implementation. So, for instance, we used iMessage service in this example, but say we wanted to have like a logging service. So if something goes wrong, I catch an exception, I want to log it. But I don't need to know the details of where that log is going to go. It might go in the event log, it might be logged to a SQL table, it might shell out to an API that does our logging from there. And interfaces actually lead into another course that we have here on Build Sharper, and that is dependency injection. So we're going to get into the details of what that means in the dependency injection course. But essentially, your application is using interfaces instead of the actual concrete implementations of these services. And it makes it loosely coupled so that your application can change and grow as needed. So now it's time for everybody's favorite segment, homework. So as always, the first part of your homework is to download the repo. Go out to github.com/buildsharper, clone the course 401 repo, and get it running on your local. And that means you're going to have to set up that SQL database as well as the ethereal.email and get everything working. Then the second part of your homework is to write a new implementation of the iMessage service. And this new implementation is actually going to take the messages and drop them to a text file. Okay? So then you can go add that new implementation to the overall program so that it would then deliver 4 messages. It would do the database, the email, the SMS, and this new text file. Once you've got all that working, go ahead and get this checked into Git, get it pushed up, and tag us on Twitter. You can reach out to us at BuildSharper. We'll be sure to give you props and a retweet. Or if you're stuck and you have questions, you can reach out to us there as well. Now, you have what you need to work with interfaces, and I highly suggest you go check out the course on dependency injection. That's going to do it for now. We'll see you next time.